Ilara Vance felt the cold not as a temperature, but as a presence. It was a silent companion that had followed her from the sterile quiet of the funeral parlor, through the hollowed-out rooms of the farmhouse she no longer owned, and now stood beside her on this desolate ridge overlooking the valley. The wind, a bitter courier from the north, carried the scent of pine and impending snow, and it stripped the last vestiges of warmth from her woolen coat. Below, the patchwork of fields and farmsteads looked deceptively peaceful, their chimneys breathing thin plumes of smoke into a sky the color of old pewter. Each plume was a signal of a life continuing, a fire lit, a family gathered. Her own fire was out. The life she had known had been dismantled, piece by methodical piece, by debt and by death. Her husband, Liam, had been a man who saw stories in stone, a geologist by training but a dreamer by nature. He had loved this land with a fierce, quiet passion. He had not loved the practicalities of farming, the relentless cycle of planting and harvesting, the tyranny of the ledger book. He had loved the deep time of the earth, the slow, inexorable grammar of erosion and uplift. He had left her with a mountain of debt, a collection of tagged and categorized rocks, and a heart full of memories that now felt like shards of glass. And he had left her to face his brother, Thomas. Thomas was a man who saw only numbers. He was practical, prosperous, and profoundly unimaginative. He had watched Liam's gentle mismanagement of the farm with a tightening jaw for years, and upon his brother's passing, he had moved with the swift, merciless efficiency of a creditor. The farm, the house, the barns, all of it was absorbed to settle the accounts. Ilara was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, pitifully inadequate sum of cash that Thomas had pressed into her hand with a performative sigh of familial duty. It was at the final signing, in the cold office of the town solicitor, that Thomas had made his grand gesture of magnanimity. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel turning in a box, and addressed the room. "I will not see my brother's wife cast out entirely. She may have the parcel on the North Ridge. It is of no use to me, but it was Liam's favorite place to wander. Let her have his rocks." The solicitor had nodded approvingly. The town clerk, present as a witness, had murmured something about Christian charity. Ilara had felt a hot flush of shame. The North Ridge was a worthless spine of granite and shale, a place where nothing grew but stunted pines and stubborn, thorny brush. It was a geological curiosity, Liam used to say, a place where the bones of the earth showed through. To Thomas, it was a tax liability he was cleverly shedding while burnishing his own reputation. So now she stood on her inheritance. A kingdom of stone and wind. Below, the lights of the town were beginning to flicker on, tiny sparks of yellow against the encroaching twilight. She had nowhere to go. The money Thomas had given her would not last a month, not even in the cheapest boarding house. The community, while offering condolences, kept a respectful distance. She was a problem now, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of their lives, and no one quite knew what to do with her. They watched her with a mixture of pity and apprehension, the way one watches a stray dog, hoping it will just move on. But Ilara was not the fragile, helpless widow they imagined. Grief had hollowed her out, yes, but it had also fired something hard and resilient in her core. She was Liam's wife. She had spent a decade listening to his quiet dissertations on thermal mass, on the insulating properties of sedimentary rock, on the way the deep earth maintained a constant, unwavering temperature, indifferent to the frantic seasons playing out on its surface. He spoke of the earth not as dirt, but as a living, breathing thing, a vast repository of patience and stability. He once told her, his hand resting on a great slab of granite, "The surface world shouts, 'Ilara.' It's all wind and heat and ice. But deep down, it whispers. You have to be very still to hear it." She walked the length of her property, a sliver of land perhaps 2 acres in all, clinging to the side of the hill. The wind was relentless, trying to push her off balance. She braced herself against a rock outcropping, her fingers numb inside her thin gloves. It was then that she saw it. Not a cave, not a shelter, but a crack. A vertical fissure in the face of the rock, almost perfectly hidden by a gnarled, ancient juniper. It was no wider than her shoulders, a dark, uninviting slash in the gray stone. Most would have passed it by without a second thought, another meaningless flaw in a worthless piece of rock. But Alara remembered Liam standing near this very spot. He had been tracing the line of the fissure with his finger, a look of intense concentration on his face. "This is a fault line," he'd murmured, almost to himself. "A place of weakness, but also a place of opportunity. The mountain breathed here. Once." She hadn't understood then. Now, with the desperation of a cornered animal, she began to. She pushed aside the stiff, fragrant branches of the juniper and peered into the darkness. A draft of cool, still air touched her face. It was not the biting cold of the wind. It was a different kind of cool, a cellar cool, smelling of damp stone and timeless quiet. She took a deep breath and squeezed herself into the opening. The rock was rough and cold against her coat. The passage was narrow, claustrophobic, and she had to turn sideways to move forward. For a terrifying moment, she imagined the rock shifting, pinning her there forever, an insignificant fossil in the making. She pushed the thought away and kept going, one shuffling step at a time, her hand trailing along the wall for guidance. The darkness was absolute. The sound of the wind faded behind her, replaced by the sound of her own breathing and the soft scrape of her boots on the stone floor. She moved forward, 10 feet, then 20. The air remained still and constant. It was as if she had stepped out of the world of weather entirely. After what felt like an eternity but was likely no more than 50 feet, her outstretched hand met empty space. The wall to her right fell away. She took another hesitant step, and then another, and found herself in a space that was suddenly, inexplicably larger. The passage had opened up. She could not see its dimensions, but she could feel them. The oppressive narrowness was gone, replaced by a sense of volume. The echo of her footsteps changed, becoming softer, absorbed by a larger area. She had found it. The mountain's breath, a room, hidden in the heart of the stone. The next day, she went to town. Her first stop was Blackwood's Hardware, a place that smelled of sawdust, metal, and old-fashioned competence. Silas Blackwood, the proprietor, was a man whose face seemed to be carved from the same hickory as his axe handles, tough, seasoned, and deeply skeptical of anything new. He watched her approach the counter, his expression a careful mixture of professional courtesy and personal pity. "Mrs. Vance, what can I do for you?" His voice was low and gravelly. "I need a good lantern, Mr. Blackwood. 2 of them, and extra fuel. A heavy-duty shovel, a pickaxe, and a good wheelbarrow. The best you have." Silas blinked slowly. He looked at the list she had written on a scrap of paper, then back at her. His eyes, small and shrewd, seemed to be calculating not the cost of the items, but the depth of her folly. That's a lot of tool for one woman. "Planning on doing some gardening up on that rock pile." The question was gentle, but the disbelief was as solid as his anvil. "Something like that," she replied, her voice steady. She pushed the dwindling roll of bills Thomas had given her across the counter. "I'll take them now." The wheelbarrow was the hardest part. Pushing it up the steep, uneven trail to the ridge was a back-breaking ordeal. By the time she reached the fissure, her muscles screamed in protest, and her lungs burned. The town, nestled in the valley below, seemed a world away. Up here, there was only the wind, the rock, and her burgeoning, perhaps insane idea. She lit one of the lanterns, its yellow light a fragile bubble against the immense darkness. Holding it aloft, she stepped back into the mountain. The light revealed what her senses had only guessed at. The passage opened into a chamber roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet across and high enough for her to stand upright with room to spare. The walls were uneven, a tapestry of granite and darker veins of schist that glittered in the lantern light. The floor was mostly level, covered in a fine layer of dust and small rock debris. It was not a perfect space, but it was a space. It was real, and more importantly, it was stable. Liam had taught her how to read the stone, to look for the telltale signs of fracture and instability. This chamber was ancient and solid. It had been here for millennia. It would be here for millennia more. The air was the most remarkable thing. The lantern flame burned steady and true, without a flicker. The oppressive cold of the outside world was gone, replaced by a constant neutral coolness. She set the second, unlit lantern on the floor and watched it for a long moment. It was Liam's test for air quality in old mines. If a second flame lit easily and burned as brightly as the first, the air was good. She held her breath and struck a match. The flame bloomed, and when she touched it to the second wick, it caught immediately, burning with the same placid intensity as its twin. The air was good. The mountain was breathing. Her plan, born of desperation and whispered memories, began to take solid form. This would not just be a shelter. It would be a larder. A fortress against the coming winter. The valley farms all had root cellars, but they were imperfect things, dug into the earth, lined with stone and timber. In a normal winter, they worked well enough. But in a hard winter, a truly bitter winter like the old-timers sometimes spoke of, the frost could creep deep into the ground, turning potatoes to mush and apples to ice. The earth, Liam had explained, was a poor insulator on its own. But rock, deep rock, was different. Its thermal mass was immense. This chamber would hold a steady temperature, likely around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how the blizzards raged outside. The work began. It was a slow, brutal education in exhaustion. The first task was to clear the floor. Using the shovel and pickaxe, she broke up the larger pieces of debris and began the laborious process of hauling them out in the wheelbarrow. Each trip was a grueling journey. Fill the barrow in the dim lantern light, navigate the narrow passage, emerge into the biting wind, dump the load over the side of the ridge, and then push the empty barrow back up to the entrance. Her hands, soft from a life of domesticity, were soon raw and blistered. Her back ached with a fire she had never known. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by a grim determination and a diet of bread and cheese. The pile of rubble beside the juniper tree grew steadily, a testament to her toil. People in the valley noticed. A farmer driving his wagon along the lower road saw her, a tiny silhouette against the sky, pushing her wheelbarrow, and he shook his head. The story spread through town, passed over coffee cups at the diner, and whispered between pews after Sunday service. The poor Vance widow. Grief has unhinged her. She's up on that worthless hill, digging for gold, some said. No, said others, she's trying to bury herself. She's become a mole woman. The name stuck. Thomas heard the rumors, of course. One afternoon, he drove his new truck as far up the track as he could and walked the rest of the way. He found her emerging from the fissure, her face smudged with dirt, her hair matted with sweat. He did not try to hide his smirk. "Still playing in the dirt, Alara?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "The whole town is talking. They say you've lost your senses. Trying to build a house in a crack in a rock? My brother filled your head with too many foolish stories." Alara leaned on her shovel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at his clean clothes, his well-fed face, and felt a surge of cold fury. "This is my land, Thomas. You gave it to me. I'll do with it as I please." He laughed, a short barking sound. "Your land? It's a pile of rocks. A monument to my brother's useless fantasies. Do what you want. Just don't come crying to me when the first snow falls and you freeze to death in your little hidey hole." He turned and walked away, his laughter echoing in the thin, cold air. His visit, meant to shame her, only hardened her resolve. She worked with a renewed ferocity. After the floor was clear, she began the painstaking task of shaping the interior. Using a smaller hammer and a cold chisel she'd bought from a wary Mr. Blackwood, she began to carve shelves directly into the stone walls. It was agonizingly slow work. A shower of stone chips for an hour's labor might only deepen a shelf by an inch. The constant tink, tink, tink of the chisel was the only sound in the deep silence, a tiny heartbeat of progress against the immense inertia of the mountain. As she worked, she felt a strange connection to the place. She learned the character of the rock, the hard, unyielding granite that resisted her every blow, and the softer veins of schist that crumbled more easily. She felt not like an intruder, but like a partner in a slow, deliberate collaboration. She was not conquering the mountain. She was asking for its cooperation. The chamber became her entire world. Its constant temperature, its silent darkness, its smell of damp earth. It was a sanctuary from the howling grief and the judging eyes of the world outside. Silas Blackwood became her only regular contact with that world. Every week or so, she would walk into town to buy supplies. More fuel for her lanterns, more food, a new pair of work gloves when her old ones wore out. He stopped asking what she was doing. He would simply look at her calloused hands, her tired face, and the stubborn set of her jaw, and he would fill her order in silence. One day, as he was loading a bag of dried beans into her satchel, he spoke. "Frost is coming early this year. The old-timers feel it in their bones." He wasn't looking at her, but at the far wall of his shop, as if addressing the rows of neatly organized tools. A hard winter, they're saying. The hardest in 20 years. It was a warning, a piece of practical local wisdom offered without judgment. It was, she realized, the closest thing to an expression of concern she had received from anyone. "I'll be ready," she said quietly. He nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible movement. He added a small whetstone to her bag. "No charge," he grunted. "Keep your chisel sharp." The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a harbinger. The sky grew permanently gray. The wind sharpened its teeth. Ilara worked with a desperate urgency, knowing her time was running out. She had cleared the floor, carved 3 long shelves into one wall, and had even fashioned a crude door from scavenged planks and a heavy canvas tarp to block the entrance of the passage, creating an airlock of sorts to keep the wind out. Her last major purchase was food. She used the very last of her money to buy sacks of potatoes, onions and carrots, crates of apples, bags of flour and beans, and jars of salt and sugar. She made a deal with a farmer on the edge of town, a man who pitied her, to trade her late husband's collection of geology textbooks for 2 wheels of hard cheese and a side of cured bacon. The farmer thought he was getting the better end of the deal, taking books of useless knowledge off the hands of a madwoman. The journey to haul the provisions up the hill was her personal odyssey. Trip after trip with the groaning wheelbarrow, her body a single unified ache. But as she placed the last sack of potatoes on the stone shelf in the cool, still air of her chamber, a profound sense of security washed over her. The lantern light cast a warm glow on the neatly stored food. It was a dragon's hoard, a treasure wrested from a hostile world. She had a small cot in one corner, a stack of books, and her 2 lanterns. It was a Spartan existence, but it was hers. She had built it not just with her hands, but with an idea. Liam's idea. The blizzard hit on the 2nd week of November. It did not arrive gently. It descended upon the valley like a hammer blow, a maelstrom of wind and blinding white. The temperature plummeted to depths no one could remember. The snow fell not in flakes but in horizontal sheets, driven by a gale that shrieked like a banshee. Within a day the valley was buried. Roads disappeared. Houses became white mounds. The world shrank to the space between four walls. Inside her mountain, Alara barely knew what was happening. She heard a faint, high-pitched whistling from the far end of the passage, but that was all. The air in her chamber remained still. The temperature held steady. She lit her small camp stove, the flame burning as calmly as her lanterns, and cooked a stew of potatoes and bacon. The smell filled the small space, a comforting aroma of warmth and sustenance. She sat on her cot, reading one of Liam's books by lantern light, a cup of hot tea warming her hands. She was an island of calm in the heart of a raging storm. For 3 days, the storm was relentless. On the 4th day, the wind died, and an unnatural silence fell over the land. The sun rose on a world transformed, a landscape of breathtaking, lethal beauty. The snow was piled in drifts 10, sometimes 15 feet high. The valley was paralyzed. The cold was the true enemy. It was a deep, penetrating cold that found its way through every crack and crevice. It crept into the basements and root cellars of the valley's farmhouses. The farmers, trapped in their homes, could do nothing but hope their stores were safe. But this was no ordinary cold. The frost line plunged deeper than it had in a generation. It was Silas Blackwood, who first discovered the extent of the disaster. His own cellar, one of the best built in the town, had failed. His potatoes were frozen solid, ruined. A grim realization dawned on him. He bundled up and made his way through the massive drifts to his nearest neighbor's farm. It was the same story there, and the next. A wave of panic began to ripple through the isolated farmsteads. Their winter stores, the food that was supposed to last them until spring, were gone. They were facing not just hardship, but starvation. Thomas Vance, in his large modern farmhouse, was initially smug. His house was well insulated, his pantry full. But his pride and joy was a new state-of-the-art storage barn, where he had kept the bulk of his farm's cash crop, thousands of bushels of prize-winning apples and potatoes, waiting for the market price to rise. On the 5th day, the weight of the snow on the barn's massive roof became too much. With a great groan of tortured timber and screeching metal, the roof collapsed, burying his entire investment under tons of snow and wreckage. He was ruined. It was desperation that drove Thomas up the hill. It took him half a day to struggle through the drifts, his face raw from the wind, his arrogance stripped away and replaced by a primal fear. He didn't know what he expected to find. Perhaps a frozen mound where the fissure had been. Perhaps nothing at all. He clawed his way to the top of the ridge, his lungs heaving. He saw the juniper tree, heavy with snow, and the small dark opening at its base, sheltered from the worst of the drifts. He saw a faint, almost imperceptible wisp of smoke rising from a small, cleverly hidden ventilation pipe Alara had installed. She was alive. He stumbled toward the entrance, shouting her name. Alara. Alara, are you in there? She heard him. Unbolting her crude door, she stepped into the passage, holding a lantern. She saw him at the far end, a wild, snow-caked figure silhouetted against the blinding white. "What do you want, Thomas?" she asked, her voice calm and even. He staggered down the narrow passage, his eyes wide as they adjusted to the dim light. He felt the change in the air, the shocking absence of the biting cold. He stepped into the chamber and stopped dead. The sight that met him broke what was left of his composure. He saw the warm, steady glow of the lanterns. He saw the neat stacks of firewood. He saw the shelves, carved from the living rock, laden with perfectly preserved food. Potatoes that were firm, not frozen. Apples that were crisp, not ruined. He smelled the lingering aroma of her breakfast. He stared, his mouth agape. His own fortune lay buried and rotting under the snow. His brother's widow, the madwoman, the mole woman, was standing in a fortress of abundance. How? The word was a choked whisper. It was not a question. It was a confession, a surrender. It was the sound of a world turned upside down, of every certainty he had ever held shattering at his feet. Alara looked at him, at the man who had scorned her, mocked her, and left her for dead. She felt no triumph, no desire for revenge, only a vast, quiet stillness, as deep and steady as the stone around her. "Liam told me to listen to the mountain," she said simply. "So I did." At that moment, another figure appeared at the entrance to the passage. It was Silas Blackwood. He had made the arduous journey out of a nagging sense of duty, a fear of what he might find. He too stopped at the threshold of the chamber, his weathered face a mask of astonishment. He looked from Thomas's broken expression to Alara's quiet composure, and then at the impossible bounty on the shelves. He took off his hat, a gesture of profound respect. "I'll be damned," he breathed into the still air. She was right. The whole time she was right. The story of what was inside Alara's hill spread faster than the thaw. It became a legend whispered over frozen fields and through snowbound lanes. When the roads were finally cleared, a procession of townspeople made their way up the ridge. They came not to mock, but to see. They stood in stunned silence before her creation, a testament to an idea they had dismissed as madness. They were humbled. They were hungry. Alara did not hoard her safety. She shared it. She gave food to those who needed it most, asking for nothing in return. But more than that, she gave them her knowledge. She walked their properties with them, her eyes scanning the rock formations. She pointed out fissures and faults they had never noticed. She taught them how to read the stone, how to find the places where the mountain breathed. That spring, a new industry was born in the valley. It was the slow, laborious work of carving security from the hillsides. Men who had once laughed at the mole woman now came to ask her advice on tools and techniques. Silas Blackwood's hardware store sold out of pickaxes and chisels. The sound of metal on stone echoed through the valley, a new kind of music, the sound of a lesson being learned. The hill sellers, as they came to be known, became a feature of the local architecture, their crude, narrow entrances a symbol not of poverty or madness, but of foresight and resilience. Alara never moved back down into the valley. She expanded her chamber, carving out a second room and then a third. She built a small, modest wooden facade around the entrance, with a proper door and a glass window that caught the morning sun. Her home was a hybrid, part human construction, part living mountain. It was warm in the winter and cool in the summer, a place of profound peace and stability. She never grew rich, but she was never again vulnerable. She had found a value in what everyone else had discarded, a strength in what they had seen as a flaw. Years passed. The memory of the great winter faded into folklore, a story told to frighten children. But the hill sellers remained, solid and dependable. They became the valley's insurance policy against the whims of the sky. Alara Vance, once the pitiable widow, became a figure of quiet respect, the matriarch of the mountain. People would bring her gifts, a jar of honey, a loaf of fresh bread, a new book, and they would sit with her for a while, soaking in the calm that seemed to emanate from her and from the stone itself. She lived a long and peaceful life, there in the heart of her worthless inheritance. When she finally passed, she was buried on the ridge, overlooking the valley she had, in her own quiet way, saved. The fissure in the rock became a landmark, a place of pilgrimage for those who understood its significance. The world is full of worthless things, abandoned lots, forgotten skills, ideas that are dismissed as foolish. We are taught to look for value in the obvious places, in the fertile field, the sturdy barn, the balanced ledger. We are taught to listen to the shouting of the surface world, the noise of conventional wisdom and popular opinion. But value is often hidden. It resides in the overlooked, the discarded, the unconventional. It waits in the silent places, in the cracks and the fissures of the world, for someone with the courage not to conquer it, but to listen to it. It waits for someone with the patience to hear the whisper of the stone and the audacity to believe what it says.